Nice set of rattles. I think he's pretty much deceased, but he is probably a good 5 foot or better. Give you an idea of the size. Might take it back and skin him. Be interesting. I don't know if I can show it to you here, but as I'm cutting through these ventral scales, you can see how they come together and go separate apart, almost like an accordion. And this allows them to compress these ventral scales. Each scale, incidentally, has a pair of ribs attached to it with the muscles to allow it to make this motion. The bottom lip, the anterior, I guess it would be the posterior lip, catches on rough spots in the ground, and then when it extends, it moves the snake forward. It's called rectilinear creeping, and it's kind of this kind of a motion. I'm trying to mimic it with my fingers as to how the snake can propel itself across the ground almost in a straight line using that type of creeping motion. It's called the anal plate. It's the last one of the ventral scales in a line there, and the anus is right underneath that. There we go. And then, so this technically is the tail. People think a snake is a head and one long tail, but technically this is the tail portion that's posterior to the anus, the anal plate. To sort of separate some of the fascia from the skin right up near the head, and now that I've got that separated, it should be a pretty easy process to just peel the skin off the entire length of the snake. I just want to be careful that I don't tear, but it actually comes off quite easily. I need to do a bit of a post-mortem on this guy. You can see how everything is elongated, all the organs. Like I assume that's probably the liver, and these ribs. You can see the ribs, like I say, right here, and each pair of these ribs is attached to one of those ventral scales that I talked about earlier that allows them to do that creeping kind of motion, also to control all the flexibility that the snake has. So every vertebra has a pair of ribs. Every pair of ribs has a ventral scale from the neck right behind the head all the way down the entire length of the body. Skin detached. I'm going to tell you, once it went off really easy until I got to the anal area where the tail starts, and I found the connective tissue was much more dense, much more difficult. I had to work my way around because I really wanted to preserve this nice rattle on the end, so I had to work my way around that. So that's the insides. We'll discard that. I'm going to stretch this out on the board. I'm also realizing this board's not wide enough because this skin will stretch, but I'm going to do the best I can. I may have to wrap it around the sides, and we'll show you how that looks here in a minute. Stretch the skin out so it adheres to the board, and as long as that fascia is still nice and wet like it is now, it sticks pretty well, and you can maneuver it, manipulate it. I'm going to get these edges as straight as I can, and then I'm going to do thumbtacks all the way down, maybe ½ inch or so apart, to secure it until they can dry. Stretched out on the board, and you can see this snake was so big, he wrapped around the edges of this board. I was able, once again, this was the challenging part. There's so much connective tissue. I tried to get off as much as I could to adhere it. I don't want to adhere too strongly to the board. When I peel it off after it dries, I don't want to rip the skin. I was able to brace the rattle up a little bit. We'll see if it stays in that position or not. And now I'm going to go down the entire length with these thumbtacks because it's very stretchy, and as it dries, it's going to contract. It's going to pull from the sides, and I want to keep the edges as straight as I can by thumbtacking them. I wanted to show you these scales. The scales are very dry. Snake is not slimy at all. He's slimy on the inside, but not the outside. And these scales overlap. This particular species, this Canebrake rattlesnake, has keeled scales. There's little ridges that run down the top of each scale, like the keel on the bottom of a boat. Some snakes have it, some snakes don't. But I'm going to tack it down, clean it up, and then we're going to let it dry for a few days. There's an outer skin that's on top of these scales. That's what the snake sheds. And once that dries, I'm going to be able to rub that off so that we'll be able to see the nice leather underneath and hopefully preserve this beautiful pattern. It's a beautiful snake. Got some great coloration to it. Look, it's even got pink along the ventral scales here. Very nice snake, very clean skin. Hopefully it's going to turn out really nice in the end. You see we've got the skin all stretched out and tacked in. I felt like I was performing acupuncture on this snake skin, but I don't want it to draw up in between. And I see where I left one tack out. I'll go back and get that. But in terms of points of interest, here are the fangs. This is the primary fang, and these are sort of the backup fangs. They're growing in place because these things break off very easily, and so they usually have a supply of additional fangs that are growing, ready to take the place of the primary one whenever it breaks off. This is the tongue I was telling you about. Many people think this is a stinger, but it's not. It's a sensory organ, as we talked about. Genesis chapter 3, the serpent was cursed to eat dust from the ground, which is exactly what they do. And then inside the mouth, I want to point out this. See that tube at the bottom? I don't know if I can get him to stay open and hold the camera at the same time. I don't want to get cut by one of his other fangs. Alright. Well, that's the epiglottis. That tube on the bottom of the mouth there. He can extend that out while he's eating to actually serve as so he can breathe, because otherwise the airway gets occluded when they're eating something that's actually larger than their own head, because their jaws can unhinge, unlike ours, and go around large pieces of prey. And that's why the skin's so stretchy. And that's one of the reasons you can't judge the length of a snake by the length of the skin, because the skin does stretch so they can swallow these large animals, which they swallow whole. Alright, we're going to have it dry out for a few days, and we'll see how this skin turns out. Standard thumbtack, and it's longer, significantly longer than the thumbtack. Just shows you how deep a snake of this size could penetrate with their fang. It's been out drying in the sun off and on for probably the last, I don't know, 10, 14 days. We've had some bad weather, so I've had to keep taking it out of the rain. And now the outer scales, the epidermis, has gotten dry, and you can see they're starting to peel off here. That's the part of the skin that the snake sheds, and I'm just peeling that off with my fingers here. I may need to get a rag or a tool, but I'll scrape off all of the epidermal skin, and then we'll peel the skin off of this board, and I'm hoping that the whatever meat or tissue that may be on the underside of this, any of the connective tissue, the fascia, that will stick to the board and come off of the skin, and then we'll be able to actually mount the skin. And right now my plan is to use the other half of this board, because it's kind of cool looking board. It's rustic. My nephew found this out on the beach at Edisto Island, and had some weathering and all to it, so I thought it looked pretty nice to mount the skin on. So as we go through it, I'll try to record it for you. That's coming along. You can see this section here. I've been able to remove those epidermal scales. You can see the work in progress here, and they come off individually. I found the best way to do it so far anyway is just to use my fingers going in along with the grain of the scales, and it seems to pull them off fairly well. If you rub too hard, you can get a little hole in the skin itself, so you want to be careful with that. And of course, when the snake actually sheds the skin, it comes off in one big piece. These are coming off individual scales because it's the way it's been dried. And as we mentioned before, a rattlesnake gets a new rattle every time they shed their skin, which can be multiple times a year. Not necessarily once a year, and the length of the rattle is not an indication of the snake's age. It's an indication of how many times a year, which can be multiple times, particularly when they're younger and growing fast, multiple times a year. And the only way you know the number of times they shed their skin is if the button is intact. That is not the button. That is simply the interlocking part of that particular rattle. The button is a separate piece. That is their first rattle that they get the first time they shed their skin. And if it stays on, if it stays intact, then you could count the number of times the snake shed its skin. But this one is not intact, and most of them are not. On an adult snake, they break off because they're very brittle. They're made out of the same material as these scales are, essentially. So it's a modification there of the skin. So I'll continue to work on this and let you see how it turns out. Loose scales, but I think we got most of it. Makes a big mess. Skin. I was waiting for the weather to get dry enough to be able to finish it off, and I found these ventral scales to be really challenging. The epidermis, to get that off. The others came off pretty easily. So I tried several different methods here. I tried a brush, and that didn't work so well. I tried scraping it with a pocket knife, and that worked okay. It was just very tedious. A pencil eraser worked fairly well, but I found what worked the best was just some packing tape. Just taking a piece of tape and laying it over the scales and pulling them right off. So anyway, I'm not sure how much tape it's going to use, but eventually we'll get all the scales off and we'll have this thing finished. It was a lot tougher than I thought it would be, and I ended up using that pocket knife again just to gently scrape and kind of peel them off hopefully without damaging the hide. And so now I'm going to try to peel the skin off of this board, and hopefully a lot of the fascia and tissue will stick to the board. Let's see, I'm able to work up the edge, and it is leaving a lot of the tissue behind, but I'm going to need two hands to pull this up without tearing, so we put the camera away. Got most of it detached. This thing is a lot thinner than you think it would be. It's almost paper thin. And then here at the rattle, just the last little bit, I want to get that on the film coming up. Hopefully I can do it one-handed. There we go. There's our snake skin. I think I'm going to coat it with something to try to condition it and then mount it. Continues. I took some of this glycerin I bought just at the local drugstore and coated both sides of the skin with it really good and let it sit for a few days. And I can't believe the amount of flexibility that's now in this skin. As a result, you can see how it was all dry and stiff before, and now it's got a lot of movement, flexibility to it. So I'm going to give it one more coat. This would be almost flexible enough to make a belt or a hat band out of. I don't think I want to do that because I want to preserve those rattles on the end, but it's a very valuable lesson about how to condition the skin, and it also brought out a lot of the coloration, which I think is really neat. Doing a project here of this Canebrake snake skin, after several coatings with glycerin, I want you to look at how supple this skin has become. It is just fabulous. It brought out some of the coloration in it, and it certainly seemed to have treated it very nice. Just glycerin I bought from the drugstore. And so what I'm going to do now is take the skin and mount it on this board, a clean board. This is the board that I actually originally mounted the skin on. You can see some of the tissue and stuff remaining from where I peeled it off. And I'll be able to use this one again should we have a snake skin in the future. But I'm going to mount it to this one just using, I'm going to try just some Gorilla Glue and see if that works and have a nice mount for the wall. We'll see if it holds up. Let that glue dry. I'm thinking it might not have been enough, but what a beautiful skin from a beautiful snake. I just love the way it's turned out. So that's how you skin a rattlesnake and mount the skin.